and welcome to the first Crash Chords podcast of 2015.
Yay!
I, of course, am Matt.
I'm John.
I'm Steve.
We are hitting the ground running this year. John has a great pick for us. But before we get to that, there's some stuff I want to go over just in reference to the year in review, and then some stuff I want to promote. When we were talking about Against Me, we were using incorrect pronouns. We were referring to the lead singer as a he, when the lead singer actually is she, refers to themselves as she, her, and we try not to do that. Obviously, we have an understanding of the trans community, and we're not trying to step on toes. It was an honest mistake. No offense was meant, but I wanted to bring that up because our devoted Twitter fan, Heather, had mentioned, and she's right.
Interesting, too, considering we made painstaking efforts to do that in the actual episode we reviewed said album.
Yeah, so that was a slip-up, but we know that the lead singer of Against Me is a she, and we apologize for the error. Also, I want to promote Nelson Lugo's Gathering the Magic is actually getting a full show run at the Tank Theater, which I'm very proud of him for. And I want to just promote the dates he's performing in January and February. It's January 30th and 31st, February 6th, 7th, and 8th, and then February 12th, 13th, 14th, and 15th. It's at the Tank Theater in Manhattan. Probably not.
All right.
And I'm really excited about that. He's also working on a new show that will come out later this year, so keep an eye out for that. Also, in just usual bumps and promotions, the Wasties are playing. They play the third Thursday of every month. This month, it's January 15th. Come on out to the Way Station and see the Wasties. They've got some good stuff planned for that show. Finally, the thing I want to bring up that Steve teased in our year in review is our new writer, Tony.
Me tease? I would never.
Not you.
Shuckums.
Tony's first article is up. He's our brand new writer and part of the Crash Chords team. It's titled Talking Points, Blue, by Mostly Other People Do the Killing, and then his subtitle, Jazz, Crime, Worthy Tribute, or Neither. It's an interesting take on this album review, as well as a comment on jazz in general. And It's a fascinating article. I quite enjoyed it. I learned a lot from it because I'm not very versed in jazz.
In many ways, I find it fascinating because it's a comment on a comment.
Yeah.
Comment on commentary that is circulating around whether that jazz is, as he says, a crime or a tribute, as it were. Because there's lots of angry people in the world, and they like to say their opinions.
Are you saying there's angry people on the internet?
On the internet, never. It blew my mind when I heard it. But he sources his material, which I was quite appreciative of. So you can read all the comment threads under Miles Davis's nephew. There's a Facebook thread in which people were very quick to support the Miles Davis side of things and flat out call this album a travesty and a clone, as it were. But it's an interesting thing. Copy, not a clone. And I find that fascinating. If there's a line there, I want to know more about it.
Yep. That'll probably be the previous post to this post for this episode, so go check it out. Also, you'll notice at the bottom of the podcast posts, we have our iTunes link. It's now at the top of the page under where you can find the podcast on the tabs, as well as in each post. So feel free to click on through to iTunes, subscribe, give us a rating and review. Going forward, that will be available in every post.
Plus, we made it easier for you guys to download it, so when you're on the go, you can actually listen to us. So you're welcome, and thank you for listening. And today, I guess we're going to go right into the album review at this point. I found this album through a website that does a cartoon, the questionable content. I love this webcomic.
Yep.
I love it. And as part of his year-end Tumblr thing, he always lists what sort of albums were his favorite of the year. And number 2 on his list was Aphex Twin. Aphex Twin has been an instrumental individual in the electronica community for quite some time. He got his start, I kid you not, at 11 years old. An engineer born and bred, this guy knows his computer stuff, and he was doing it from age of 9, 10, 11. He actually took a computer, the ZX81, and transformed it into a music-making machine. Now, the curious part is this machine had no ability to produce music. What he did was he actually altered some codes to create tones to a plug-in television when you hit certain codes.
Wow.
This guy saw music and saw engineering and put them together. He sees them as like just linked, just one and the same when you get down to the bare bones of it. For that reason, he's been all across the board when it comes to electronica itself. Acid techno, ambient techno, IDM, though he doesn't really like intelligent dance music. he's had his hands dabbled into all sorts of really first-generation techno pieces. He's also been the inspiration for a bunch of different artists. Linkin Park, Thomas from Daft Punk, Wes Borland from Limp Bizkit. These guys who have made, I guess, similar ideas, have infused electronica into their music. They've all been on record saying, yeah, this guy has, influenced us. He's been making music since the early 90s, in at least record format. So before then, he was still a DJ, still a mixer, and still producing a lot of his own work. But he hasn't made an album since 2001. It's been a very long hiatus. That's not to say he hasn't been active. He's released EPs and LPs in smaller scale. He's done a lot of mixing and remixing. And this album, Syro, is the child of 7 years labor, 8 years labor, he's quoted as saying.
Several tracks, perhaps not all at once, perhaps not the album as a whole, but certain tracks, perhaps just being the way many electronic musicians work, is in the way most of us would, let's say, update a file that we're writing on our computer. You leave it in a folder, and then after a while you take certain notes and you put them in other folders, and they get little captions, and eventually you might fuse them together. So pieces of snippets of ideas that were in the making years ago may eventually come together later on. It's impossible to know exactly how it went through, but he was quoted as saying 6 or 7 years on several of these tracks at least. So it's quite the monstrosity. And it's funny because 2001, for a hiatus since 2001, I mean, that's almost the entirety of this millennium that he was absent from the electronica community, aside from maybe a few side things that he did. I'm not entirely sure.
He's always been sort of a mixer DJ kind of person.
He released some things under a pseudonym, AFX, didn't he?
Oh, don't even... He has more pseudonyms than he knows what to do with.
Yeah, so it's very possible that he has been around. You can't exactly say that the electronica community has been evolving without him, but it's interesting because I hear certain elements of earlier electronica, of the kind of stuff you might find in the 80s or the 90s, but yet it's still always looking toward the future at the same time. Perhaps that's just the nature of electronica in many ways. So from that we go into Syro. First, a little note on the name. The name itself is what they call a neologism, meaning it's just applied by the person who originally coined it. In this case, that would be his son, I believe. And that was just the name he blurted out. I think it was actually a title quoted later on here within one of these tracks. What was it?
Sirobonkus.
That's the one. Sirobonkus. Perhaps it was just blurted out by his kid while he was listening to some of the earliest incarnations of this album while it was in production. From there, we have the actual album. But it's a nice little homage. So we begin with, and let's say something about the names here. The track titles themselves are, in many cases, gibberish. At least that's what they mean to us. I would probably reference what I said earlier, the fact that very often when you're putting together snippets of ideas, there is a system behind the man who puts these things together and has names for them, numbers for them, some personal Dewey Decimal System, and that's what I personally believe is what I'm led to take from these titles. For example, first track, Mini Pop 67, brackets 120.2, brackets source field mix. And that is only the tip of the iceberg as far as these track titles go. Stay tuned. Just to start off this track here, I want to hold off on tone. It seems like the likely place to go, but I think it'll just suffice at this juncture to call it electronica, which should tell you where you're at, but there's more to it. I instead want to start off with rhythm. This track is a fixed 4/4 time signature, as is the majority of his work, but there is a lot of internal decoration, as I would call it. You'd be hard-pressed to lose the rhythm because of the dominant brushing sound that's in the background. That kind of dominates this intro. It's got the brushing motion and the harsh cutoffs that you might expect from a beatbox. And it's generally working in, 16th notes, just divvying up the measure by 4, and these quick notes sort of popping off of each other with quite a bit of regularity, some minor variations, as, let's say, pleasant but interesting cycles of what the measure would otherwise call for. Things that just kind of make it move along and not feel like it's a continuous motif repeated for the sake of it. But now then, when the bass synth comes in right after this, and again following that when its echo, a much higher, tinnier synth follows, the start of, and I've frequently used this word before, a hemiola is apparent. I've described this before as a ratio of 3 to 2. Here it's presented as a single note every 3 16th notes. As you'd find 4 of them in a measure here, this is a pattern that would line up every 3 measures of 4, except that he usually calls off that pattern in favor of something else. As for the higher synth note that follows, what I called an echo, I call it an echo because it begins the pattern on the second beat instead of the first beat. So you have this slightly offset nature here, which kind of comes across as an echo, and then it continues to do its own thing. Plus, that sound effect in itself is fed through an echo filter of its own. So immediately I get the theme of pitter-patter in the beginning of this album. This, if you could call that a theme at all, it's just a sensation of things bouncing off the walls. It's electronica, but in a looser sense. It's texture at its best.
And this texture starts bleeding through in the evolution of the different levels that he's working with, the different layers that he's working with. Because that bass orientation plucking also starts getting drawn out as far as the notes are concerned. They stop hitting just sharp edges and they start flowing a little bit more. But he doesn't allow any of his layers to really, I guess, evolve too fast, evolve too far from where they started at, because this is an evolutionary track. It does go from point A to point Z, while not very quickly because it tends to be a little bit longer. This is close to a 5-6 minute song. It does flow in a very natural progression.
It's natural. It's also very subtle. There's moments where you might not gauge exactly where one section begins and where another ends. Actually, that's overstating it. You know where it ends, but yet there's certain elements that carry over, and you're not exactly sure whether they've fundamentally transformed or whether you're getting more of a gradual evolution over the course of this track. Sometimes things could be passed off as just bald-faced departures.
The problem that I had with this track, though, even though there is some semblance of evolution and cohesiveness, it gets a little disjointed by the vocalizer that they have in here. I really just don't like how it sounds. I feel like on this track, the vocalizer didn't really mix well, so you have this pretty good mix of sounds, and the vocalizer just slapped on top of it. It's not in the mix, it's just put on top of it.
Yeah, the vocalizer, as I compiled a list of oddball things in which he has in this track that could perhaps be called those bald-faced departures, and the vocalizer is certainly one of them. As far as I can discern, it's just speaking gibberish, to the point of sounding sort of maddened, definitely raving, like a raving lunatic almost, over the beat work. And the beat work, in many ways, could be seen as reflecting that. So, I mean, I'm not about to call that a departure just yet, but it's certainly not easy on the ear. And that's only, again, the tip of the iceberg as far as what's easy on the ear is considered. That's where I want to enter in with tone. I think this is a good time to do so. Because you're not exactly in standard note frequencies here, at least not as far as I can discern. Just poke around the piano. I don't really detect this in any known key. It's a semitone. A semitone is what you'd say between an A and an A sharp, for example. So as an electronic musician, this is all fair game, because it's just as easy as a setting change. All he has to do is just, turn one little knob, and then all of a sudden, well, you're not on A, you're not on A sharp, you're somewhere in between. Which makes it kind of a bits to jam to if you're actually trying to do that as a musician, but that's obviously not the point. To a pitch-perfect person, I think they would find it certainly jarring, and I think that we all sort of have the 12-tone system in our brains to a certain extent, and there is something about this track that sounds wonky, and it's not just the inner transposition. So I would bet that that's part of the reason we feel a little bit unsettled, is because we're somewhere in between with this piece.
But I don't consider that really a detractor, either that or the vocal work. The vocals were not so present as to become tiresome. They were not so in your face for me to really see that as a major flaw. Maybe at times it felt a little jarring, but honestly, after my first listen through, I was okay with it. I was grooving along with it. I was focusing more on the percussion level, on the actual rhythm level in a second listen through. Not necessarily first, but the second listen through, that the through line with that rhythm section just keeps the piece together, keeps it from falling apart, and it makes me a lot more accepting of anything that he's throwing on top of it.
Which, the piano section?
No, the more rhythm orientation that he does in it.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, the the rhythm is going to tie together most of the tracks in this album, I think, because as I said, that usually is the staple. That's the thing he holds pretty true throughout. In many ways, you could detect some bleed over. I think that is the binding factor of this album, if there were to be a theme, is just the rhythm pattern in general. I don't know exactly where to place it. There are times where it sounds a little bit funkier than others. I wouldn't quite call it at that point yet, this early. But I want to talk just a little bit about the back and forth between certain sections here, because there are moments where this gets particularly dissonant. I mentioned transpositions earlier on. If, let's say, you just accept for shits and giggles that you are in A or A sharp or something like that. Let's say you're in, because we're in between. Let's say you're in G quarter sharp. That's your home. Then you can bet your bottom dollar that at some point you're going to be in B quarter sharp, and I mean on the drop of a hat. There are certain sections, as I said, that just seem like bald-faced cutoffs, and this happens perhaps 2/3 of the way through this track. I can't pin it down exactly, because you've already gone through several different stages. For one, I mentioned earlier on, I thought you had mentioned it, I made a mistake, that was the piano section, which is actually quite a light-hearted turn, where it seems like this is shifting away from the dissonant tones that would really use a lot of those tritones, flat fives, flat twos, things like that. And then all of a sudden it opens up. We breathe, and it seems as if we're in major. And that's where the piano enters. And it seems a lot airier at this moment until that harsh cutoff where all of a sudden we've transposed to an entirely unrelated key. And it's moments like that where I do question the goal of a piece like this, and why I couldn't agree with you entirely in calling it a perfectly effortless evolutionary piece.
It doesn't seem to evolve as clearly as you think it does, John. Or, to better phrase, I don't see that evolution as clearly as you do. For me, it's a bit of a little bizarre track that staggers around here and there, and while I'm not saying that the vocalizer is necessarily a negative to the track, it's a negative to me in my ears. I didn't really enjoy it.
I wouldn't dispute something like that.
And also, I just feel like that bizarre dissonance that Steve is talking about, while it might not have been unnerving to you, I feel like it's what makes this track, the entirety of it, feel a little off.
Let's put it this way. If again, B quarter sharp is your home or something like that, then let's just say home is not where the heart is in this piece. Home is a dark and scary place that you don't travel from, you transport from, in several different instances, to places that are sometimes darker, sometimes scarier, and sometimes, in the case of the piano, the Twilight episode, where the town is just right, except for one little thing that won't stop bothering you for the duration. This is certainly not the kind of piece that is like taking you down the rabbit hole necessarily, but it starts you off on an awkward foot, and it made me recall an album that we reviewed earlier on in episode 54 called Boards of Canada's Tomorrow's Harvest, only because of that album's persistent revisiting of those 70s and 80s electronica motifs, which seems to be, as we stated earlier, Aphex Twin's it seems to be his influence. It seems to be where a lot of electronica artists' influence are. Sure. They want to go back to that because that is the dawn of electronica as an art form, as an entire genre. So you hear that in various different elements here. You hear it in like a droning, muffled synth that stays in the background. That sounds very 80s. And when you combine that with some of the dissonant clashes, it made me recall Tomorrow's Harvest. But at the same time, you also hear a much more arcade-esque soundbite solo just smack dab in the middle of the piece. And then you combine that with the piano, and it brings to light the fact that I think it's the form of this piece that is really where it suffers. It gives you a lot of everything. It's a nice, I guess, as an overture for this album, but it's hard to really find that home, especially at the end. And this is, I think, the coup de grace, the bizarre vocal solo or just vocal insert near the end of the piece. I'm not talking about the vocalizer in the beginning, right. The crisp vocals that you hear at the end, which is just like him presumably, is sitting at his desk at the computer where he does his work, and a microphone happened to be nearby, and he was just humming along. And maybe the record button was on, so he just decided to remix it after the fact. What's so unnerving about this is not the fact that he remixes it, that's to be expected, but that the quality of the voice itself is in such contrast to the vocalizer in the beginning, where it's muffled here, it's perfectly crisp. It's the first sensation of anything purely acoustic on this track. Everything else is clouded in distortion and filters. So it's a fascinating exposition, but it's not yet alluring.
Yeah, I just wasn't quite sold on the first track. I didn't hate it by any means. I'm not saying that I did. I was looking for... I don't know what the hell I was looking for, but this wasn't it.
And I don't think we're going to quite get it in the next track. Xmas_event 10, bracketed Thanaton 3 mix.
Event 10.
Event.
I didn't find
know.
an N, but
There was no N.
okay.
And
I don't
in the
know.
brackets,
Just verifying.
in the brackets, there's an even 120, and then Thanaton 3 mix. So this one, I mean, this had more flow than the first track. From the get-go, it felt a little more cohesive than the first one, at least.
It should be noted, though, this is a 10-minute track.
Yeah. So, I don't know. I mean, my biggest problem with this 10-minute monster, and there are other monsters of almost equal size later, is this one, even though it had more cohesiveness and flow, than the first track, it still felt like it went on too long. And I'm probably getting a little ahead of myself, but I just, on a whole, I felt like I didn't know what he was going for here. I didn't know where his direction was headed.
I think he ponders a little bit too much on the more sectional, like clear-cut sectional work of this song, because between an A, B, C kind of a orientation that he's doing here, he's got some very distinct, almost freestyle points in the track when he's doing the electronica version of a jazz solo or something of that sort. It starts off as a very eerie introduction, and it does change from there. But the first part being 3 minutes long and not really changing too emotionally, you get that freestyle. The second part hitting a mid-level, emotional level, thought process level, you get a freestyle.
I'll cut in and be the first to say the freestyle is the absolute peak of this section for me.
Yeah.
I love it.
Those are the
great.
peaks of the entire song, but the valleys, the build-ups to it are the piece, not song, correct. The entire build-up isn't there for these peaks.
Well,
There's nothing culminating with them. It's a little disappointing in that respect, because maybe if they were quicker on the uptake, maybe if he was doing this at a more rapid pace, cut it down maybe 2 minutes. I'm not saying do that, but maybe.
I don't even know if that's the problem, because, see, Steve mentioned Boards of Canada before, and one thing I loved about Boards of Canada, even though it's not an album I revisit that much, I still really like that record because every song you're steeped in a setting almost immediately. You feel like you're somewhere, and you can identify where you are. But for track 1 and 2 on this record, I'm in a black hole, and it's terrifying.
Well,
I see nothing, I feel nothing, it's emptiness.
Oh, I can't say I feel nothing.
Well, I don't know that I feel nothing, but it still doesn't feel like a clear location. It's blurred. It's undiscernible.
I mean, ironically enough, there are many tracks on Boards of Canada's Tomorrow's Harvest that were indeed terrifying, apocalyptic, one might say. I feel this goes in similar directions, but we're not yet steeped in something yet. But I do believe we get there later in the album. For this 10-minute track, I think it's more about these little perks here and there. It did seem as if this was the track of all the tracks here. This seemed to be the single track that I would not have made the longest one on the album. I don't think I could actually describe a later track as being a monster, as it were, even though we get close, like 6-7 minutes.
Right.
We don't get anywhere near 10, and yet I don't think they feel their length in 6 and 7 minutes. This one is the only one that really does feel its length. The freestyle section is absolutely brilliant, but it's true, it does not really expand much. It seems to be a recurring motif, a very complex, detailed motif, but a motif nonetheless. If I were to say this goes into a B section, and again, this is perhaps even more of a gradual transition than the first track, but I'd say the B section is a lot smoother. You're dealing with these little chimes that occur in the background. I would liken it to almost like a Buddhist monastery. It seems we get a lot more peaceful toward the midway point of this track. But then we start kind of unraveling that a little bit. As I recall, there's a lot of slide work going on, just back and forth. Every single note, every synth note that it falls on, it always has to the target is never exactly where it lands. It's always just a half step below, a half step above. It's like, and every single note, you can't exactly predict where it falls. Now, predicting music is never a good thing. You don't want to predict music. But I do think this is purposely evasive.
And the evasiveness, I think, with those sliding notes that you're talking about, is what makes it so hard to follow, because you don't have to be able to predict music to enjoy it, but at least being able to follow along helps. If you're completely lost in chaos that's not entertaining, it's hard to really be on board, and those sliding scales really kind of make for a more confusing track that, again, goes on too long.
It continues certain elements, like the pitter-patter for one, but then it also does lead in as we get into like the next track here. We're not quite there yet, but we do start going darker places that are more defined, and this could be sort of an exposition for that. But if you're going to call it an exposition, boy, it takes its time, and you don't have the context yet. You can only look at that in retrospect. At this point, you're still very much just real time, chronologically speaking, just trying to figure it out, and you're just kind of poking in the dark.
Well, one thing that would lend some credibility to that argument is the more glitch-oriented nature that we get in this track, which does lead into the next piece fairly solidly as like a theme connecting piece.
Oh, yeah.
But this track itself does have one big redeeming factor that I love, and that is the multi-bass line that he throws in there. Sometimes he's got doubling and tripling of bass at different parts of the scale.
Well, I heard two elements.
Great.
I heard two elements specifically. There was a lower bass that was a lot more rounded. It had a lot more depth. It even sounded as if it may have been doubled, but of course that's within the distortion of the filter. But then accompanied with that, and seemingly a little bit delayed, going with that tactic, you get one that's just a little bit lighter. It feels like it's a much brighter bass, and that is a single note. And they contrast each other just by being offset by rhythm, and yet at the same time they're very much in sync. I think they have nearly the same pattern as they go. Although I think several times the double lower one kind of goes off and trails into different things. There's other little features here, but again, there's all sporadic. There's anything I can really say, oh yes, this is tied together with the theme of the track. For instance, you got a nice bongo work. I thought that was interesting.
Which actually came off as tablas, I think, in post-production.
Yeah, it's true, because that's the nature of that sliding work, is you feel that sliding nature, which you can only get on tablas. You can't really get that on bongos, not to my knowledge, not effectively. But because he's doing that in post, you kind of hear tablas a little bit.
My problem with the outro, though, that John was mentioning earlier, that the connection piece to the next track, is that we have to sit through 2 minutes of something that's not necessary to get to that little 30-section connection
like a
piece.
slow jam, sort of, almost.
Well, no. It's not just that last 30 seconds. He does introduce glitch elements throughout this track.
But they're not.
Throughout this piece. Before he gets into it, they're not as connected as the actual outro.
And they're just not as standoutish that it warranted another 2.5 minutes. This song could have probably ended around 8 or 7 minutes, and still with a similar kind of connecting bit at the end, and been just as fine, if not better, because it wasn't dragged out.
It still kind of surges in various moments, though. You have that little funky riff. It's kind of like a breakdance element, almost, nestled inside this nearly noir backdrop. But perhaps not quite time to use that word yet, because the next track, we get track 3, Product 29. Product as in Produk. 29 brackets 101. This went through another really bizarre transition, but this was a lot more interesting. It tapped into more of a rhythm and blues style to begin with. I rather enjoyed this. I think this was much more of a jam. It had kind of a swing element to me also.
It was approaching almost easy listening. Almost in the very beginning, it was a little cheesy. It was a little too on the nose. But
you think of like 80s reggae?
It's that transition as he starts...
Not reggae, but rhythm and blues.
He starts introducing a lot of fluidity in the bass, and the way it's bouncing back and forth, the way it starts rising and falling and changing on the notes, that transformed that original rhythm, which felt safe, yet showed... there was a lot of complexity that was just untapped in this case.
Yeah, and I think that cheesiness that you're talking about goes back to that the dominant sound that you hear here is sort of a convoluted brass section, almost like something you'd hear out of Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. What was the name of that track again?
Boom Shake the Room.
That's what they use in reference?
It has a similar sliding sound effect. But also what's really cool about this track is, it's the first time there were moods sort of in the other tracks, but this one's where we really get steeped in a distinct mood and setting. It feels very noir. It feels very like you're in a sleazy club, not a dance club, but like a club where gangsters would go to drink scotch and smoke cigars. It felt very seedy underworld kind of thing.
And that's where it develops from cheesy into sleazy, and that's what I thought was such a bizarre transition. But maybe that's just interpretation.
And it comes around that part where you hear some girls chatting, and they say the line, "When we were in that club." Nice little soundbite that gets thrown and distorted and effed around with in there. Yeah. And at that point, it does kick it up a notch. It does become less R&B, a little more hip-hop oriented. And that's when they're also taking those drawn-out synth, and they start blending them into full string work. That is really interesting, because it's not just go synth into strings. It is, well, that note sounds better when it comes from something replicating a violin or from a violin itself, instead of being a computer-generated piece. And that back and forth, that tete-a-tete he starts going through and starts flushing out, is really interesting, very beautiful.
Yeah, by the time you're in the B section, it's I describe it as sort of a dark, spacey chordal sequence. It's much slower, a lot more drawn out, and yeah, I would definitely bring to mind a sleazy alley, And by the time we reach the section following that, you get this is where you, I think, get the first elements of true progression in this track, where it's going somewhere without necessarily departing the form, while departing form, but without departing tone. You get this tritone stacking at some point. It's like a tritone arpeggiation on top of one another, and you get this echoing. And then all of a sudden, almost comes down to silence, almost pure silence, before the drums just enter here and just enter this little swing-style lead-in. It's very interesting, and it was the first part of this album where I felt like I was immersed into a kind of story, like something just transpired in this dark and sleazy alley, instead of me simply getting the impression of it.
Yeah, no,
I've had up to
this
now.
definitely was less impression and more full-on picture. It's the first time I really felt like I was somewhere on this record, instead of kind of just floating around in confusion. And what helps that is just the way he embraces that rhythm here. He lets everything kind of link up and work together in a more cohesive manner. Not that there's anything wrong with chaos in electronica, but I really liked in this track how he let things kind of link up and build on each other. There was a definite evolution in this track that we had not heard before.
Mm-hmm. And I also really liked the closing section, which is sort of a slow sequence. It was a lot thinner, and it seemed to be slowly getting a lot more tightened, a little bit more intense, like the situation in the alley was coming to blows or something. I don't know. Again, all of this is very subtle. But I felt as if the music was making these slight little chromatic adjustments within the chords. You can't really exactly say what it is, but that's just the subtle nature of the way he does progression. Whereas one person might feel bored and just accept this entire track as monotony. I hear distinct things growing at this point. It depends from place to place, but this track thoroughly had me invested. Then we go into track 4. To do this properly, 4-bit 9D APL plus E plus 6 bracket 126.26.
What I like about this track is it's the first time also we get a clear connection. Track 3 and 4 are clearly connected, at least in tonality a bit. They're not direct connections, but they definitely feel related.
If track 3 was the greasy spoon, was that dirty glass, track 4 is lighter. It's still got dirt, but it's more of a dirty rain. It's not as thick, as oily. It's not coming off as noir. It's still coming off in that same sort of vein, though.
I actually got a little bit of reggaeton.
Well, because
I'm in the
early
middle
rhythm
of the city and it's blasting out of some distant window.
The early rhythm in this track has a steel drum-esque kind of sound. It's not actually a steel drum because it's all electronic tones, but it resembles a steel drum. And that steel drum with a speedy bass work really kind of give this kind of creepy groove that connects to the previous track.
I should say I inferred a steel drum.
Right.
Whatever that means to you.
Yeah.
And in this case, it's a little bit of a change from what was happening earlier. It seems like the bass line is staying within certain areas, section by section, part by part, and that the rhythm is the one that's really growing more complicated, that is propelling the track forward. It's the changes in the percussion orientation that's keeping it lively, that's keeping it from falling back into the darkness that was in the previous piece, but also moving it forward. Also allowing the introduction of those drawn synth strokes to actually fit into what's being built on this kind of dirt.
Yeah, it's actually you get. That's I think why I define this as more of a like a space reggaeton or something like that. You know, a lot lighter. You still feel the lighter element, but it's so strange as to how he can sort of combine, you know, the dark and the carefree at the same time. Maybe perhaps this track succeeds more than any other in that regard. Because you still even get a couple of freestyles, just as we got earlier on, barring the fact that we have very light synth, as you were just describing, in the background, droning on, and yet that's very deliberate in its chord-changing sequence. You know, I'm getting something that I can at least digest at this point, as opposed to those bizarre chord changes that are just, you know, poking around on the keyboard. This is something that's a lot more rounded, a lot more digestible. But then we get kind of a robotic freestyle along with that. That's the freestyle is not as open and breakdancey as it was, let's say, in track 2. This is a lot more robotic. It's a lot more staccato, and yet all of this, in some bizarre way, kind of pushes that noir feel along. But it's still got that groove that you just can't ignore. It's kind of like everyone just stood up at the club rather than laying back in their dark corners concealed by curtains. Everyone stood up. They're on the dance floor now, and this is still not a club the average person would frequent.
Also, what I really like about this synth sound that's in this track is it's this first hint we get of Aphex Twin's kind of 80s influence. It's not a heavy 80s sound, but there's definitely a sense of that Axel F style Beverly Hills Cop theme synth. It's definitely there, and what I like is that even though that typically on its own could be pretty cheesy, here, because of the elements he mixes it with, it kind of does stand up and sounds good. You know, and then again, I'm a fan of Axel F like anybody else, so I don't mind that there are hints of it here.
This actually does work well as a transition, because if you're talking 80s dance floor orientation, what comes in track 5, 180 dB underscore, is...
Bracket 130.
Can't leave out the bracket 130.
I apologize.
They're in every track.
I felt like I defined the track. All I could think about was 130.
Me too.
This was very much introduced at face value as a 90s house music, a 90s thunk, 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 get on the dance floor. Exactly. And frankly, I thought this was going to be a house song. I thought it was going to be kind of throwaway. It worried me.
No house would be a song.
No, I thought it was...
House piece.
The first 30 seconds was actually worrisome, but it was when you started picking up that very gradual synth drags that he was putting in there, the very light touch that quickly did evolve into something more complicated. That was phenomenal. The evolution and the changing in this was really amazing.
But that evolution, Steve said something interesting about it. You notice an interesting layering from the beginning. But what was really interesting is that everything comes in, but it gets denser. It doesn't actually change necessarily in volume or in style. It just, there becomes more of it. It becomes a thicker piece.
And that's what made this the most interesting track initially to me, is that I sort of took this differently. I didn't quite get the house feel. I actually thought this was an abstract rendition of that THX sound effect that you get in movies when you're sitting there and getting all revved up, and then all of a sudden it's and everything seems to get denser. It's kind of modulating a little bit, and meanwhile you're rumbling in your seat waiting for the big reveal. It seems like it took pieces of that and then just kind of unwrapped it. And it starts using what you interpret as kind of a house, or, you know, you could even call it dubstep straight out. There's sort of a lone thump as soon as this begins, and then you're right. It's just one. It starts with like that one that one tone starts layering 2, 3, 4 for a while. I feel like I'm knee deep in some kind of bizarre 13th chord, but it builds to the point where the rhythmic motif that's actually playing all of these together start playing over and over and over, and it's an interesting rhythmic motif, but it remains for almost the duration of the piece. Still, I was absolutely loving it just from an academic standpoint, because as we add those higher synths, I mean, I was really immersed in that THX logo, and I mean the high synths that were added behind it, the waning, the screeching in the background, like things are being pulled out thread by thread, or falling down piece by piece. It's an insanely unraveling effect, and the only anchor you have is the solid rhythm that you initially got.
And those would actually feel disconnected if you didn't have those high energy, playful hi-hats that were interspersed throughout it. Even when the quote bass drum gets dropped out for a section, you still have sort of a snare hi-hat combination going on that I think really marries the two really distant ideas to one another in such a way that everything just becomes infectious. It just gets inside of you. It's one of those blood-pumping songs that, yeah, you would actually see in dubstep, in a club, in something nowadays, but at the same time, there's so much complexity that you could pick out of it. There's so much little things going on here and there that it's introverted yet extroverted.
I also, I mean, to be honest, I would completely omit those terms. I feel like this is an academic experiment unto itself. I don't think it was really meant to inspire emotion of sorts. It was, but it gets you moving in a way. But you don't know whether you want to be moving to it yet. It's an oddball of a piece. But what really fascinated me about it is also the fact that timing. It always feels like that rhythm is on the brink of becoming repetitive. It always feels like, okay, haven't we had a little bit enough? Granted, it interests me, but, hasn't it run its course by now? And whenever you get to that point, it always feels like it's on the brink of something happening, of, let's say, a full-blown B section. But you never get a B section. It's just a continuous revision of A. It's a variation on a theme, that rhythm, that motif being your theme. Instead, what you get is the synths will fade out. You'll reduce yourself down to the thump, purely just the 1, 2, 3, 4. Then you build it back up again. So you get these gradual things, the fade outs, the contortions, the frequency shifts. These are the things that really make the A section in A prime and A double prime, and as many renditions of A as you would like. It never seems to just be the same section from minute to minute, or from second to second, as you might guess it had been. It's very bizarre.
And the same thing applies to the further sections. This is an idea that actually keeps getting pushed. The envelope keeps getting pushed throughout the entire piece.
I think it's how it's meant to be taken. Just subtle variations on the one motif. And it definitely raised my eyebrow. It left it raised, again, academically at times, I think. But at the same time, I'm also enjoying it. So, as far as I'm concerned, that is the perfect line between what... I know he may not like the term intelligent dance music, but I think this is the track on the album that best sums it up.
And we move from one interesting track to another, because track 6, CIRCLONT 6A, brackets 141,
Thank you.
0.98.
Thank you.
Brackets, Syro mix.
Oh, of course.
Can't forget that part.
Can't forget the Syro.
That's a specific mix.
Title track.
What I like about this track is the disconcerting and distorted intro gives way to what is pretty much glorified, and not in a bad way, MIDI remixed Mega Man music. I mean, it feels very video, early.
It feels like anime, like if a quality anime had done the Mega Man TV show.
Well, it certainly incorporates...
Like the back and forth of it, the high music that's going on here. This is him just showing off.
It certainly brings in 8-bit sounds, so that's part of the reason why you feel like you're immersed in that environment. And in doing so, it presents you with the story. This time, a full-blown story, not just your impression or your picture starting to form. But I think this is a full-fledged scene. just the chord changes themselves thrust you into the middle of a battle of sorts. It's chaotic, and the chords are kind of regular. There's a lot of 5s and 1s. This is hardly off-the-wall stuff. It sounds very rousing. Also, I have to note there's expert stereo work going on here. I mean, you get the sensation that there is not just chaos, but chaos in motion. It's happening around you when you're really immersing your headphones. You know, there's things bouncing off left, bouncing off the right. It's more in full swing here, I think, than in other places on the album, because this album is so because this track is so filled with animation, and
that kind of gives it this rapid fire feel, like you're in the middle of a battlefield. And I equate it to Mega Man because in a lot of the Mega Man games,
it's a very high energy thing.
Well, they take place in the future, and there's always so much going on screen. Things you got to shoot, things you got to dodge, you got to slide, move.
Plus, the video game itself has an amazing 8-bit soundtrack. All the renditions of early Mega Man were just phenomenal 8-bit soundtracks. And my analogy to more of an art scene version of Mega Man is just that, well, someone may have just remixed it, and it's like a full-fledged episode, like they were playing that game, or a similar game, or just, you know, maybe a Japanese import of this, that, or the other thing. And they decided, well, what is the story actually going to be like? When I'm not pressing the buttons, what would it be like if you were to picture it? The way it changes, not tempo, not actual speed, but just what it's showing. When you feel like, well, maybe they were fighting on a ledge, now they're inside here. When they're fighting inside and then pop out a door and they're in a landscape, maybe they're doing the stare down when they're about to just do something big.
I'll give you some examples to that effect because of the fact that I said I described this as a full-blown scene, not just a mere picture, but something that actually has action within it. There's a transition after you get your initial sense of the battlefield, as it were, and again, it's hard not to invoke these things, games, anime, that sort of thing, because it is very lively. But you get a transition which almost seems to pull back from the blatant fighting, as it were. It pulls back a little bit more to like a rope-a-dope, like a tete-a-tete, where there's more sparring going on than there is actual fighting. And that's one of the instances that you were talking about, where it seems as if, certainly not the tempo has changed, but something has cut out. One instrument has cut out in favor of something else that is perhaps a little bit more playful. The chord changes they've shifted a little bit. Perhaps we've gone to like the relative minor or something like that. Again, I did not actually analyze this song from a musical standpoint, more from a form standpoint, because that was far more fascinating in this instance. Frankly, the chords themselves, probably heard them before in terms of all the various fight scenes in the world, so it didn't seem like it was worth it. But then after you get that transition, where it seems to be this kind of little miniature rope-a-dope, you get a B section where it's purely a light drone in the background. It seems to project imminence, like there's a foggy head at play, while the chaos continues. The synth is just like the white noise that won't go away, and yet it encompasses the same chord progression that existed in the first section. After we've had this little rope-a-dope insert, now we're back to the original chord progression. But yet there's that imminence there, like you feel the necessity of obviously the urge to win, the need to win. There are things on the line. You get that. Then, as we move into the C section, it's even more imminent, but this time it's no longer white noise. It's more focused, it's still chaotic, but it's joined by several new elements. You get like these little crackling synths that form kind of a round, and then the climax is this progression of halting and shorter notes. Just like as staccato as you can possibly get, and you can get pretty damn staccato when you're dealing with electronic music. So, as short as he wants to make the note, it comes across as jarring to the human ear, because it sounds like some kind of ear test that's being done at the doctor's. I mean, that's how awkward it is. And yet, that functions as the perfect climax, because it gets your heart rate going. So, just as I said before, I wouldn't interpret this as some kind of like foggy head white noise imminence. It's more like a full-blown, how would I describe it? Like you return to the battle of sorts. It's a full-blown ternary form, it seems, like an ABA.
Right, and that ABA, you get a sense just from the sound it feels very reminiscent of the earlier part of the track, but has still evolved. And it gives this whole song a cyclical nature that I really enjoy.
Yeah.
Like a story that comes full circle.
It's hard for me to say whether it's actually ABA, because this final A prime, I initially termed it as a C just earlier, because it is so varied. But that's the nature of really any scene. You know, you have... The exposition should match the conclusion in many ways.
And what I like about the conclusion is it halts suddenly. It just stops. Almost this idea of you walk back into battle, but then the rest is history.
But my one nitpick was, because I've actually reversed my mind on this, my one nitpick was I felt a little bit too condensed for what had come earlier. But frankly, I like the speed that everything's going on here. That change is a lot more welcome in retrospect. It brings your heart up quite a bit more, and it makes you open up your eyes. Especially considering...
Well, which is it, one or the other? I mean, do you like the fact that this...
No, I do like it now. I do like it now.
Okay.
In hindsight.
I didn't know which way you were reversing.
No, I'm reversing.
I didn't know where you were before you reversed.
Now, not a negative, it's a positive. You wanted to get a little bit of your of a heartbeat going on here, because you had a couple of successive tracks of just noir, setting. This is something that's actually propelling maybe the story that he saw, maybe just the idea of this album. I think further along.
Let's withdraw a little bit. We've been far too vague in terms of theme to really pin down this track's function in terms of theme. It's really just a function in terms of arc. As far as the listening, the experience of this album goes, you get to this track and suddenly you're a lot more involved than you originally were. Perhaps you were just listening to it as background noise initially, but with a curious mind, and now all of a sudden you were invested. I think that's a positive thing to say for any album's arc, and that's regardless of all the very extremely technical things that he's doing, especially that section with the halting staccato notes. I mean, that's just, it's jarring, granted, but it's wonderfully precise. And that you realize that precision, this is exactly what electronica music can deliver with you, where other things may fail a little bit. I mean, ultimate precision that just kind of, it satisfies us in some innate way. If I had actually one nitpick, it's at the tail end, just at the outro, when it was sort of meandering back and forth between the bass kind of falling down the scale a little bit, and then a sections in between, which were, I don't know, just a little bit barren. Kind of like it seemed barren for the sake of this track. It went back and forth, like maybe 4 measures and 4 measures, where 4 measures were spent like just the bass falling down a little bit, you know, and you get kind of a sensation that it is wrapping up, and then in an interim, it just decides to stagnate or plateau. I don't know if that really served any function, but that's a pretty minor nitpick. Regardless of that, I do like the way it ultimately ended, which is just on a dime. I mean, you know, completely cut out, harsh cut off, no fade outs.
And it goes into the interlude of the album. FZ, pseudo time stretch plus E plus 3, bracket, 138.85.
I love what this is exactly for what it is. I found it kind of a almost near brilliant intermission, at least in the way it started. Just the vocals beginning, and again, we assume this is just his vocals, but they are... he's remixed the hell out of them. He's broken them apart down to the vowel, down to the consonant, slowing it down, kind of like that scene in The Matrix when he's actually being pulled out of the Matrix, and you get that telephone sensation. You hear the individual, you know, kind of what he did with the vocals. Pretty cool. Because of the fact that he gets near silence and then starts contorting it again, winds it up, builds it up, and all this is happening within, we're talking
20,
maybe
seconds?
15, 20 seconds.
Yeah.
Because the remainder of the track, it sort of yielded to this overlapping 8-bit... actually, that's the transition that should probably be discussed. Out of that vocal work, we get this 8-bit augmented chord. It seems to be an augmented chord just overlapping each other, which fills out the tension, kind of like a horror scene, but also a little bit like the like your epic battle exposition, or like the kind you get out of a symphony. You know, just the tension that an augmented chord usually sets up for you. I specifically thought of a horror film, but that's very brief. Even that only lasts perhaps 10 seconds before finally yielding to something that was a little bit safer, something that was kind of just a groove in which you immerse yourself in for about 40 seconds to break up the heart rate tension that's been building for now about a track and a half.
Yeah, and
that's the ultimate purpose.
The robot cowboy.
Again, in terms of arc, this is a success.
Yeah, well, and also the whole song does still have that kind of horror background. It's not immersed in horror, but it kind of looms that unnervingness, which I think is what really well connects it to track 8. It kind of that looming almost horror gives way to CIRCLONT 14 bracket 152.97.
Bracket Shreemoming mix? Shreemoming?
Something like that.
That was one that I can't do that one.
So this track starts and you get a really fast-paced sense of space horror. Like, it feels like you're locked on a spaceship with a big ugly thing.
Not full-fledged horror. It's cyberpunk meets the noir that we got earlier in the album. It's cyber noir.
We can never seem to go full force with anything here.
Yeah.
No.
It's always like almost horror, shy of horror, shy of noir.
Things, yeah.
You know.
Well, that's actually what keeps it aloof. What it keeps it undefinable.
No,
and
I'll give it that.
For this, the speed rhythm, the space echo that's just pervasive in this whole thing really is a great duality of what's going on here. It's techno, and this is the one that I think really best exemplifies techno on the entire album. It has the most core feel of that word on this entire piece.
I think the whole album is techno blatantly, but no, I want to withdraw that a little bit. It's tough. I think this is the one that brought forth beatboxing most to mind. You get that a lot in the synth, which is, well, sporadic as always, as it was in the beginning. But there's music here. I mean, this beatboxing is pretty meandering as of this point, but behind that there is music. It's funky within this. It's an oddball expose of funk, but it's pretty cool. I got into it almost immediately. Beyond that, though, you have the eerie depths of what lurks in the background. For instance, one was the voices that sound kind of like whispers in the distance. That clashed a little bit with that forefront funk sound to me. I feel like I was essentially dumped with a variety of emotions as of maybe a couple minutes into this piece that I didn't exactly know what to do with. I didn't know which one to follow 100%. For instance, by the time we get to the B section, then yeah, you're right. It is really a lot more techno. It's like improv techno at that point, only because of the freestyle that you get. That sort of freestyle twanginess is almost like it's scatting along. Granted, there's a pattern here, but that's what you feel. So now, how many different emotions have I just taken you through? You follow like my confusion. I think at this point we have all settled, and it's time to talk about this album frankly because we're several tracks in. We've all settled on our satisfaction with the eyebrow raising middle ground that this album has placed us in. But there are also times where it really, really wants to be several of these things, and one of them very strongly, and then pulls back last second, gives us something else instead. It's hard to say whether that's the intent, but that's the effect.
If anything, I would say it's kind of indulgent. The artist here, Aphex Twin, seems to just be stretching his muscles. He is trying out all sorts of different ideas, and I don't see them really being scattered from track by track, from piece by piece. Maybe as a whole, we're seeing some scatterbrain going on here, but when you're talking about track 8, like, you start with that kind of noir, dark space orientation. You get into the B section. It feels like it lightened up. It got a little more.
Oh
hopeful.
yeah, I wasn't done yet.
Expansive.
I could have continued. That was but the B section.
The way it evolves, I still think there's a. It may not seem cohesive, but I still see a natural progression.
I think the
from
opening
part
up
to
that
part.
the opening up that you're describing, like by the time you get to the C section, it's a little bit more subdued, and the female voice returns. This time, a little smoother, a little bit more crooning, and then you have an identifiable progression here. It's just sort of, 3-2-1 down the minor scale. over and over and over and over again. And the change between these sections is so gradual, it's almost indiscernible. But then by the time you get to the next section, it's progressively, it's less animated, and yet then we get the drums kind of pick it up at the tail end, and I don't know. At a certain point, I returned to the pitter-patter that I experienced in the very, very first track, and that was all I was able to say for it, was pitter-patter. Intriguing pitter-patter, but that's still pitter-patter. It's pretty scattered.
The fact you say, and I'm going to point this out now, that you can't really tell, or you can, but it's hard to tell the gradual changes from each section. That I think is a point in the positive column in this case, even though the sections are so distant from one another emotionally.
It's more like this. If you asked me to pinpoint the time stamp in which a section became a new section, I could easily do it for you. There's no doubt about it. The question is more about the emotion that has been left. By the time I get to, let's say, section D, as I call it, which is more dominated by drums, although perhaps you could just envision that as an outro. By the time you get there, was A really important? Is it on your mind? Is it tied together? Did it yield you to this point? Or was it just a present thing in the course of his stream of consciousness that might well be forgotten?
And that's right there, that phrase you just used, stream of consciousness. That, I believe, is one of the best factors. I was going to save this for my closing finale of this album, but just the way he's changing your mind as the song progresses, I believe, is one of the best aspects of so many of these tracks.
Well, there's still more to say on that front, so we'll not go there yet, and you can still use it.
It's a preview.
Fair enough. Track 9, Syro. Perhaps this is the title track, who knows? Syro U473T8 plus E brackets 141.98 close brackets, new brackets, piezoluminescence. It's sort of Italian.
So this is a track where from the very beginning we get a heavy 80s synth feel. It's a much more an exposition on what I had mentioned that was only teased earlier. I get this sense, this beautiful picture of a red light district, as Steve put it.
And that actually relates perfectly back to the title itself, piezoluminescence. Kind of reminds me of piezoelectricity. It's that would be an electric charge that accumulates in certain solid matters, such as crystals, certain ceramics, and biological matter, such as bone, DNA, and various proteins, in response to applied mechanical stress. Interesting. So it actually means electricity resulting from pressure. That kind of relates almost. That's a sort of red light district you're talking about. The neon is just, it kind of consumes you in a certain way. The pressure of the outside world. Who knows how far you want to go with this? But at least this time we have a little bit of theme to work from.
But the red light district kind of vibe yields to what I envision. You know, a lot of the also 80s and 90s cheesy Double Dragon games, like the first stage when you walk the streets of a red light district, flashing neon lights, and that kind of gives this kind of a groove here, and I really like it. I'm very indulged by it, if no other reason because I'm a sucker for some good cheesy 80s synth, and there's quite a bit of it here, which was nice. Not to say it was the only thing, though.
Well, the rapid percussion, the way it seemed to phase from high end to low end and to even phase out, it gave a lot of the mid-level layers a breathing room to really stretch their legs, to kind of do exposés in different parts. But what's going on here, I think there's another case where it's breathing a little bit too long. As we're going through these sections, they weren't doing it the same way Christmas was, but they are getting a little bit stale. I have to call it Christmas. It's Xmas.
Sure. I definitely found this track pretty funky, to be honest. Maybe it lost some steam a little bit.
That's it. That's exactly what it was for me.
But it was still funky. It was still enjoyable. I think, but you all know my soft spot for funk. So at the same time, this album is
a term you coined, well, maybe you didn't, it probably exists somewhere, of electro jazz funk. This kind of mesh of these sounds. It wasn't clearly jazz or funk.
Well, that was later on. In the beginning, it wasn't quite there yet. This is a small section later on. Actually, in the beginning, it seemed to almost be like a copy of an earlier riff or something like that, and I was almost getting tired of it. It seemed like this could have been a filler track. But then later on, as the bass sort of stepped in there, it seemed to be a little bit more interactive. You have this sort of loud softening effect, lots of dynamics. But it was really the C section, I think, that this took off after like a little bit of a transition, where again it sort of returns to that pattern of going back to the very, very short staccato notes. The C section delivers us, starting off with a very, very, and this is as much of an exposition as you can get. Starts off with a very high, very tinny note, and it just holds for a little bit. And then we get a few of those before we dive directly into what I termed the electro jazz funk. It's very technical, and I was enjoying the crap out of it. And it seems to, in this short span, it seemed to be like, diving down chromatic a little bit, diving down chromatically, but it was all just way too brief. I was loving this section. I felt like this should have defined this track. I absolutely loved it, but it yielded immediately to, again, these sections that I don't know how to describe. It could be a D section, perhaps it was just a closing section that brought back several different elements earlier in the track and then kind of fused them together to play us out. But it was lots of just enjoying himself, I think.
Yeah, the track on a whole seems to go on too long, but that said, there was a lot to enjoy here, and I do agree that
I think I enjoyed the track. It's more just like when you take it a step further and you start considering it from an academic and critical standpoint, then I have to take a step back and wonder the purpose.
Right, because especially that last end bit that we were talking about that you got very immersed in briefly could have stayed around longer for no reason and would have added to the song, but instead he jumps away from it very quickly. And I mean, it could be also, as you said, as part of the clothing to go into track 10.
In fact, then there was another section after that, or maybe this is the real outro, which just sort of brings in a little bit more of a spacey vibe, and we're all kind of over the album here. There's definitely moments where certain things start to blur together.
Yeah, and I mean, it does link up okay to track 10. PAPA, T4, brackets...
Papa T4.
Brackets, 155.
Brackets, pineal mix.
I said penal off the air, and it's clearly not that.
Now it's on the air.
But now it's on the air.
You can't take it back.
Nope.
Well, there you go. You just put your foot in your mouth or whatever that saying is.
Let's avoid mouths and move forward. So I got a sense...
Actually, it isn't the gland. The pineal gland is an area of the brain.
Okay. Thank you for that aside, Steve. This kind of had a vibe of a highway cruising song. It was very fast moving. In fact, faster than a lot of the stuff we had actually heard before. One of the fastest tracks on the record.
It's second quickest at 155 BPMs to, I believe, the next track. It's
another exploration of a singular motif. You get this pattern that's sort of the same over and over and over. If you're in the minor scale, then you'd count this on sort of 2-1, 2-4-5, 3-2-1. It continues, and it's kind of like a highway drive. I think that's how you interpret it, Matt. And I mean, the ambient work in the background I thought was especially glorious. It just underpinned the beat work, and I actually enjoyed it a lot more than I enjoyed the beat work itself, which is sort of a shame, because beat work is cool, but it had been a little bit redundant by this point. The background, the synth, that was really where my head was at.
Well, you got to remember, it doesn't stay in the background throughout the song. It does take steps forward and steps back. But this is really, that synth is very ambient. The combination with the just speed that's going on with the beats, very oriented towards like hi-hats and snares, it doesn't just stay at that level. By the time it gets towards the end, you're getting rapid fire kind of notes, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 notes at a time that are spanned where there used to be just like 1, maybe 2. The speed that's going on here, the complexity that's going on with just the rhythm, I was enthralled by it. I loved what this rhythm was doing. I loved every moment of that beat work.
My problem with that rhythm, though, is that while this song was completely rhythm-driven by the midpoint and gave that conveyance of kind of a highway drive, almost maybe even the rumble strips if you're starting to go off the road a little bit,
I think it was figuration driven. I think it was that 2, 1, 2,
All
4,
right.
5, 3, 2, 1. That was over and over again.
But the thing about the song that I think really suffers from is the fact that with all these things going on, there's not much more to it. I mean,
no, there was a very distinct bass line going on in the background as well that kept poking its head forward that I think did a great job of just propelling it along chronologically.
yes, and the song does move, and I don't feel bored per se, but I just feel like it could have done a little more. I'm at this point kind of tired of being in this weird, chaotic place. I want something else, you know? I want either a little more cohesion or, I don't know, maybe some more interesting things done with that incredibly fast rhythm work.
I would say that we really haven't had this layer of chaos yet in the album. That this really is the culmination of that idea of discord in a song.
No.
This track,
The beats,
the first track was more discordant.
In the rhythm, I would say yeah.
No, sorry, I can't agree. I don't get that sense of chaos from the rhythm. It
Or
actually feels
perhaps
very
I'm at a
repetitive.
moment where I've been immersed into his world for long enough, where I guess within his context,
We're better
I can't-
understanding it,
We're
maybe?
better understanding the. Yeah, it's possible. I still will make the claim that even having been immersed, I think if you go back to the first track, that is the most discordant track on the album. He really wants to just unsettle you from the get-go. From there on, it's, as he termed, a little bit more poppy.
Yeah, it does
he says
get there.
this is as poppy as it will get for him. I forget if he said that about a particular track or about the album as a whole, but definitely he has darker sides. He can go further than this. Not that I'm saying like the first track was like the pinnacle of this album, but in a different sense. But it was certainly the pinnacle of the discordant sense, if that's what you're looking for.
From here we go to track 11, which is gobbledygook, but here I'll read it anyway. S950TX16 WASR10 brackets
Wazzer.
163.97 Earth Portal Mix. Wow, we actually have English words in the remix part. This is where we get the fastest beat work on the record. And we get some interesting keytones that kind of really...
Yeah, speed is not. I just want to interject that speed is not anything that was really like on the forefront. I mean, of my mind. I know you've been sort of both going on about it, like, oh yeah, fastest beat work of the record. It's not anything that I really consider when I was confronted in the beginning of this record with all that. You know, like I know he does beat work, and I know that it's usually pretty dense. So that alone is not really anything to grab me. I think it was really more of the fact that he returned to the whole steel drum thing. Like we mentioned earlier, this was a little bit more airy, though, but perhaps it just felt airy because of the steel drum and the way in which it was mixed. Granted, of course, it's not a steel drum. We've established this. Everything is synth, but it's just the way it came across. But frankly, I feel like we got this already. At this point, I felt like it was rehashing.
Yeah, this was a little more towards rave music than in just about everything else on this album. But it didn't have one of the biggest features of rave music in this day and age, which is the dubstep idea of get a lot of very heavy kick drum in there, get a lot of very heavy bass drum in there.
Yeah.
Didn't have that. That is exactly what you said. It opened it up. It left it airy.
And it had also even went further than that. It did have a distinct B section where you move into a got spacier again. It got spacier. You a lot more. It sort of echoes in the background. It seemed like there was this thing that kept recurring, but it pushes it further into the distance. It was. I'm not sure how it connected, but it was there.
Well, it didn't connect because he really just as he's making this part, these transitions, he's like F transitions. I don't need no transitions.
I think I did.
He's
recall
going
that.
from an idea. And then doing a new idea, and then, as I think Matt put it,
on this track, amongst others, I was least defensive.
Well, what he did with the transition is not that there were no transitions at all, but that he would transition by simply jumping from place to place, and then put in a transitionary piece after making the jump. Almost like, I'm going to physically push you there, and then lead you.
That's what I meant earlier when I said you don't travel from home, you transport from home. But maybe you travel back.
Right, and
if that's what you're getting at.
And this was the most distinct way of seeing that. You were literally teleported from piece to piece in the song, and then transitioned once you were there. Like, here, shove you in the door. and now here's what you're looking at. It was very kind of backwards-ass, but in a way, that was kind of interesting. It was the only interesting thing, really, for me about this
makes
track.
for a unique form that I don't hear often. That's
Yes.
true. That went over my head a little bit with this track, but I'll take your point, as I frequently sort of bombarded you with things you didn't notice at the time. But, I don't know. Anyone else have anything to say before the final track, which is quite a doozy for this album?
Not really. I feel like this track kind of was a lot more of the same beyond that thing that me and John noticed. The final track...
Yeah, one last thing. I think we might be cutting it a little bit short on this track, only because I still really enjoy the layering. That's one thing I think we haven't really been harping on in this album. I'm going to bring it up before the last track, because in this album... the transitions, we may say good, bad, or otherwise, but the layers themselves are extremely complicated. Not just when we start talking about the dents, but some tracks, track 6, I mean, probably upwards of like 20, 30 layers of music going on at any given point. That's pretty freaking chaotic in and of itself. And that's something I want to point out. It's pretty masterfully done when you can actually balance those pieces so that you're not bleeding out ears.
Yeah, but that said, I mean, also we take an interesting turn for the final track. Track 12.
And that's why I brought it up now, yes.
Which is actually...
We're just angling to get there.
letter for letter, the name Anastasia in all lowercase spelled backwards. Then brackets,
Comes
102.
across as Aisatsana.
Yeah.
Aisatsana.
This track is simply a piano track. There's nothing else. It's just a piano.
No, there is something else. There's one other thing.
There are things later. But for the intro,
birds.
Just a beautiful piano track. And what I like about this is an outro, as an outro removed from the album, is that it has that finality that's in a really great outro. However, as an outro for this album, it just doesn't really fit, only because there's nothing to finalize.
You had said earlier off air that it came across as tacky to your ears. That's a fair assessment, especially since we've indicted frequently albums that utilize the sole lonely musician playing in the middle of an empty auditorium on an unkempt piano. It's almost how this comes across as. There's very little mixing going on. It seems like it's just bare bones acoustic piano. You can't get any purer than that. We haven't had hardly any acoustic on this album. I only noted the vocals that were present in the beginning, which were barren, but at the same time still heavily mixed. We get the female vocals in the midst in various places, sometimes just speaking, sometimes more crooning. Just a lot of miscellaneous gibberish, but there's nothing that I would identify as an acoustic instrument. I'm sure all of it is just passed through a variety of filters. But here, at this point, all of a sudden, he felt it time to deliver us something pure and homely, and not only did we get that, but we get the nature in the background. You couldn't be farther removed from the computer and the patching and the, wires into who's and what's it. Instead, it's just pure nature. Piano and birds. I mean, maybe that's not pure nature, but, well, it is to my ears. And then beyond that, the track itself is so slow and sort of barren in it itself. There's very little... It's hardly a melody here. It's pretty much just the chords, this background figuration. You can't call it really background because I don't think it's a foreground. It just repeats over and over with a very slow, staggered pace. It's not in your face. It barely even seems to be alive. It's like taking its last breaths.
It's a mellow, somber tone. I mean, at one point, even towards the end of the track, you hear the pedal tap of what I'm guessing
I
is
believe
the
that's
keyboard.
I believe that's the piano itself. I think it's a pedal tap. It could be something that's layered in addition, but it sounds almost like the jolt that you get if you're sitting at a big grand piano, and presumably it's not your highest maintained Steinway in which they would try to keep that sound to an absolute minimum. Sometimes it's just impossible. You play the piano, and especially if you're at a very, very soft spot where you're holding the note and it continually deteriorates, and then finally it's time to tap the pedal. Otherwise you get bleed over into the next chord. And then when you tap the pedal, it's just a quick up-down, and that creates a jolt, which is audible if you have various different microphones attached and clipped to different parts of the piano, as would be for a professional recording. So I was all about this track in its utter simplicity. This is pure minimalism. I love the fact that it lacks a foreground and it lacks a melody. There is the question, though, and I am returning this to your claim, the fact that it felt tacky. I think I was able to accept this track, but if you're going to call it tacky, then it is the fact that it is the antithesis to everything else. And that does seem a little bit sudden, but I still enjoyed it. It was a big relief, especially considering the last couple tracks, I had less positive things to say than you. I was finding more bleed over than I had earlier on. It was becoming kind of just a wall of noise to me, in which this let me breathe.
But what John had said is that this is not actually that foreign to what he does, and I don't doubt that. It just fell foreign to this album as a structure. We are ultimately rating this album as a whole, as a piece. And I just felt that while I like this song, it did feel out of place for the record we were presented.
It still uses the same basic ideas of what he had done in every other song on this album.
Peace.
Which is... No, thank you for derailing that train of thought.
There's like a couple little vocals.
Every other piece on this album, and that is take an idea, replicate it, and evolve it as it goes along. In that context, it is completely in line with everything else. In every other context of what we'd come to expect, yes, it is an oddball, but I think that just speaks to... That's just the reason why it's more beautiful.
I don't think... I mean, are you saying it is an acoustic echo of the patterns of the other tracks?
That's an excellent way of doing it, of stating...
well, I only prompted you there. I didn't say I agreed with that assessment.
No. I like that metaphor.
But as I say, I don't agree with what I just pinned on you. I think that this track is a very stagnant track, and I love it for its stagnancy. It doesn't show the scatterbrained, subtle evolutions that the rest of the tracks do, so I think that would be false. I think that would be a false analogy for this. I think this is trying to create something, if you were going to try to spin it around positively, and I do want to, because I genuinely don't enjoy this track, I'd say it's trying to create something that is stable, something that you can latch onto, whereas various other tracks purposefully try and mislead you and make you believe in the aftermath that what you see, what you perceive, is not always what's real.
Okay, it sounds like we're done with this.
Oh, I think so.
Yes. I guess
it was a doozy.
I'll take us into our wrap-up, since Steve still seems like he's grasping at straws a bit.
No, I just need to breathe, man.
Okay, so... It's very easy to compare this to other electronica that we reviewed on the podcast, but I'm going to try and avoid that and just kind of go with what we have in front of us. I feel like the first and most important question when reviewing an album, well, it's maybe not the most important, but it's an important question. Did I enjoy it? I still don't know. Not sure. I had a very Steve experience. Steve always likes to tout about how he's very much about the moments. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I did very much enjoy moments of this record. However, caricatures of the other co-host aside, those moments weren't enough for me. There's no denying his talent. I mean, just based on what John, the other co-host, told us at the beginning of the review, that he's a talent and he knows what he's doing and he's done some incredible things from very early age. I feel like there's better cohesive pieces out there than this. That's not saying this is bad. I'm just saying that there's better. I mean, I definitely enjoyed moments, and there are sections that are very reliant on each other. There are definitely a few 2 or 3 track combos that fit very well together. However, the album arc as a whole, theme for sure barely exists. If there's a theme, it's very hard to see. Arc, there are moments of an arc. And as John put it, there are definite elements that he uses that feel to almost be an arc, but the arc, if it's there, is also not clear-cut. It's definitely subdued, some other subword that I'm looking for, in there somewhere.
Subliminal.
There you go. I'll go with that one. But for me...
That would be tough.
For me, Syro just doesn't really hold together as an entire complete piece. I feel like there are definite moments that I enjoy, and there's definitely a talent here. He's not an average electronica player, clearly, because of the influence level he has.
He plays that electronica, doesn't he?
He does. I just don't feel like this really meets a standard of electronica that I've come to expect just based on other artists we've brought on the podcast. So, that said, this exists in a very weird place for me. It's definitely above average, but it's not that next step. There's nothing here that really felt very next step for me. So I'm clocking it in as not quite a 3.75. It's a 3.6. It's not exactly a 3.5. I'm not putting it right in between a 3 and a 4, but it's a little bit above that. But the lack of a clear arc, the lack of a clear theme, where that may not necessarily be a bad thing to some people, really hurts it for me. And I barely emotionally connected with it. There were moments. There were definite settings I got steeped in. Like track 3 and 4, clearly, there was an emotional connection there. But a lot of the other tracks to follow after it kind of took a downturn towards the end and got a little repetitive, and then picked up with the final track, which clearly had an emotional connection in that somberness. So that's where I sit with this at a 3.6.
Well, I tell you, you scoff at my consistent harping on the moments, but frequently the moments are exactly what make up life, and well, orgasms occur in moments. I mean, there's not anything to sneeze at. But it is true that when I consider this album, the moments are actually far more drawn out to me. Now, you also said something before about him as an electronica artist, and also about this album perhaps not being standard fare from what you've experienced so far on this podcast as we've looked through electronica music. And we haven't looked through a lot of electronica music by far. I'm pretty impressed, actually, with what this guy's done. I think this was a solid album, and also to impugn you earlier on, I don't think I was grasping at straws before. I genuinely believe that this is the theme that this album is going at, is going toward. I don't think these things are accidental, but I do believe they're far more difficult when you're dealing with electronica music. I think that electronica is the kind of thing that strikes people as lofty. It strikes people as a lofty ambition. Sometimes, because often electronica could be used for the most simplistic of purposes, simply to set your theme at a party and keep the beat going, status quo, keep them dancing, almost like a metronome, and just copy-paste, relay. It's difficult because how are you supposed to convince people that that's not merely what you're doing? How are you supposed to convince people that you're stepping over that threshold and moving into something that took painstaking effort? And we know this album took painstaking effort. I even read one little note that in the course of producing this album, it came to the point where they were patching different things together, different synths up with other again, I'm not exactly sure about the technical process involved. I'm more of an acoustic musician, but it apparently came to the point where after 3 months of doing this patching process and working with a recording engineer, the person he was working with realized, crap, I'm doing it wrong. He had to start over, and 3 months was essentially undone. That's what really goes into electronica when you have your heart set on a project, and I'm sure that he did. So that brings me back to the theme that I described, and I do believe this is some kind of exploration of slowly changing your impressions, like an example of impressionism that evolves over the course of time. Very often we're looking at impressionistic pieces that simply are what they are. The impressionistic piece is the Monet painting, and it stands still, and it never goes anywhere. Well, this is the kind that changes your interpretation of the Monet painting, as if the phasing had just altered itself. The focus lens had just sort of shifted. I think that's what's happening here, and I see it in almost every single track. As to the effect on the audience, I think you have to deliberate about. You have to consider, well, what I want out of a specific track, is it really that movement of emotions? Because you're human, you have taste, you're bound to settle on one emotion, in which case that one moment, or rather that one movement, is your cup of tea. If funk is your cup of tea, as it is mine very often, well, that's where you're going to go. But art doesn't take into account these things. It reaches to make a statement, and I think it was a very effective statement. I think this definitely exceeds a 4 for that reason. I think it succeeds in its artistic purpose. As to the reachability and its attempt to bring in outside observers, foreign people to the genre, in that it failed a little bit and remained a little bit too lofty and went into the trap that many people expect from electronica music, which is you're in love with your ideas. And at the end of the day, when you come up with a beat framework for one particular track, and then you're fast forwarding in your digital audio workstation, and you want to just sort of improv a little bit, you work and you come up with another idea for the same part of the track. Well, now you've got 2 ideas. How are you going to make them work? Fuse it somehow. Come up with a transition. This is inevitable, but it can be done in an artistic way. To the listener, sometimes it's just a mishmash. I think this resides at a solid 4.2 for effort, because the art takes over in the end, that I can't simply give this the A+. It's an A++. But below the true A, which is actually the 5, but that's neither here nor there. You know our rating system.
It's an A-.
A, sure. B++. Yeah, whatever.
Well, damn, you basically did all of my closing arguments
for
me. You stole all of my closing arguments.
I'm sorry.
Save one. So I won't repeat myself.
The piano.
And that is, I think the main reason might be, I don't want to put words in your mouth here, Matt, but the main reason you might not connect with this emotionally, and I will say, when you're talking electronica, emotional connection is one of the most important features you can get out of a song. Whether it's just high energy and the things associated with that, like wrath or lust or something like that sort, or if it's the low ambient ideas of just going on a journey and feeling depression or just warm happiness or something of that sort. This album, track by track, song by song, for the most part, I see it as Steve said, as a art piece, but one where you're not looking for an emotion. You can't look for the emotion in these songs necessarily. If you find one, great. That's a song you connect it to. But you have to accidentally stumble across these ideas. You can't try to pin it down. If you don't see it right away, you may never see it. And this is definitely going to be an album that I kind of liked it. Only kind of liked it the first time I heard it. I really liked it the second time, and by third listen, I was starting to fall in love with some of these songs. It's definitely a grow on me kind of an album. I'm happy I did not have time to really sit on this for 2-3 months, because it came out back in September. I'm glad it's very new to me, because honestly, it shouldn't grow. I shouldn't do a rating after it's grown on me. This might be an album I'm going to bump up dramatically at the end of the year. But this you just have to clear your mind and go for it. And if you get it, you get it. If you don't, you don't. I think that might be the bald truth with this album. And if you don't get it, I don't think you're ever going to be able to get some of these songs. That being said, I agree with Steve on pretty much every point up to his rating. It's a 4.25. It is a solid, really upper echelon piece that isn't breaking any boundaries.
Upper echelon is 4.5 plus. Remember that. That's upper echelon.
Okay, excuse me. Upper piece, not quite the
upper
echelon.
Piece.
Not the echelon piece.
It's in the goods.
It's entrenched
in the goods. It's got a firm footing, not going to fall.
Yeah, it's not breaking any grounds, because so much of this stuff we can say, oh, this was like this, this was like this, this was like this. We can make allusions to stuff, and when you're talking electronica, frankly, if you can't describe it, it's either the best or the worst, period.
I'd also describe it as this. I mean, if you're looking at the piece from a technical standpoint, it's far too technical for it to be average. This is the work that went into this, and it's apparent in every single flourish, every rhythmic flourish. It's apparent that this is very technical, and you can get immersed in that alone, regardless, whatever the hell you think about this album's theme. Not everyone is looking for that. Probably most people are not looking for that in electronica, but we're pretty harsh on that field. And And perhaps that's the only area where I would keep it my 4.2 rather than that solid rounded quarter, is just because, theme is a very, very elusive point.
Well, I think you guys make some really good points, and I think thinking more about it, I am probably being a little overly harsh just because the emotional connection wasn't there for me. It's impossible to deny the level of skill that is featured by Aphex Twin.
Not all art surrounds emotions themselves.
Yeah,
They're
and
concepts.
But beyond that, I think that it does warrant the fact that this is not on par with pop or not on par with some of the rock we've done that's been ubiquitous and samey. And 3.6 does lend more towards an average feel, whereas I might not feel it's as upper or below echelon that you guys think it is. But to really hurt it just because I didn't connect to it as much as another electronic artist is not the fault of this artist. That's on me, not on the artist. And I think that this should just float right around where I put the last electronic artist we did review, because it makes more sense. I don't think it's over a 4 because I personally don't see it in that mess that's there. However, you cannot deny his talent. So I will bump it up to a 3.9. Cool. It would go over a 4 if I think I made that next step connection. That John's right. You're either going to get it or you don't. If you don't, it's hard to see that next level. But you cannot deny his talent.
So average it together, over the 4 in the average. There you go.
Yeah. So
it's pretty darn good. And I was very happy. I'm very happy choosing this for our new year, new season.
It's definitely better than how we started last year.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. The too technical to be average, but you can't just give it A for effort. I think it's more. There's more effort in here than simply that A for effort stupidness.
Right. At this point, I want to talk a little bit about what's to come in Crash Chords this year. I teased it a bit at the end of last episode after my thank yous. The big one that I want to talk about first is since we're starting a brand new month of January, we will have a brand new guest this month who I mentioned. Fan favorite returns, Keita St. Cyr, burlesque performer, producer, and just all-around awesome person, is going to join us at the end of January. I'm excited to bring her back. Last I heard, her goal is to bring us new J-pop.
Yay! Yay! Oh, yay! Yeah, I don't have to choose it this year because I'm still meaning to get to that one.
Why can't you just take the false and the things you'd like seriously?
Because I don't know it well enough to actually pick one that I think might be a good discussion.
And so we'll have that to come. But I don't want to just talk about what we're doing as a website. Obviously, we brought on a new writer. Obviously, we're going to be writing more this year.
I actually am starting writing over again, and you're going to see content from me. I'm making that claim because I've already picked out 3 albums I'm doing reviews for, and I've started 3 articles that I'm doing reviews for those 3 albums. So,
looking forward to them.
Stuff.
Looking forward to them.
I'm so happy. I'm finally writing again.
Yeah, that how many articles is just sitting on the website with a title? I love those titles. They're so alluring. I just
We might as well delete those posts that are just titles. He's not reviewing those albums. They're over a year old.
Well, no, not only
fairness,
that,
though, this podcast is incredibly time-consuming as far as our review minds go. But there's better things coming in the new year. You can expect a lot more from a new writer also, one Tony Catalano. That's a big thing that I'm expecting for 2015.
I've seen some of the other things he wants to actually do, and the way he contacted us, the way I kind of fell into this, because I know Steve knew him beforehand.
I was in a bizarre correspondence with him over the nature of the merits of pop music, which kind of speaks to almost exactly what we do, especially when we're looking down to the minutia, If you're just talking about like the little elements of pop music, especially this also goes back to the whole music of the moment, looking at the moments, that can be extracted. And in many ways, that's the defense that people have against what otherwise would be called very, very generic pop. Still, this stuff can be discussed, and we were having very, very enlightening discussion on that.
When I first saw his proposed ideas, one of which is now published on the website, I was like, I immediately thought, wow, there's somebody who actually thinks like us.
Right. Well, what I like about Tony's writing is
nice,
that it's not 100% serious and droll. it's very easy to get steeped in reviewing stuff and get overly serious. We've even done it here on the podcast. But what I liked about his title alone that I read earlier is that it hints at a little bit of tongue-in-cheek. Not a ton, but a little bit. Like, to give an air to the article that we follow on the site. I mean, between our guests.
It leaves room for debate. That's the most important thing on the internet, is that so many people are just so assertive, and that's the end-all be-all. You can tell as early as the title in so many articles around the internet that's the extent of how their beliefs will change. They're not going to evolve. That is the end of the discussion for them. The rest of the feedback, the retorts and all that's just white noise for them, essentially. That's lost in the ignorance of the internet as they perceive it. So to present an article that says, look at it critically, look at things critically, that's what we aim for here in the podcast, for sure. And it's refreshing to see it in writing, as we will be delivering with more frequency in 2015.
What I liked is it reflected our evolution from last year. We talked a lot about in the year in review that we influenced each other more heavily this past year than we had ever before. And I'm looking forward to more of that in 2015, to constantly challenge each other and ourselves musically. Because it's very easy to fall into a rut. Like me and John have talked about it. We fell into a rut with Green Day. We thought, we'll just like everything by them. Nope.
Yeah,
so wrong.
Followed by episodes 14, 24, and 37. I don't think we'll be revisiting Green Day.
For a while.
We're going to revisit Green Day.
Oh, jeez.
I'm going to give it a preview before I decide to bring it on the show, though.
Oh, jeez.
No, it's still weird looking back at the stuff that we've done on the website and the stuff that how we actually have evolved as a critical thinker. But I know I have, and I know these guys have, taken a little bit of time to reflect over the last few months, and we want to start actually pushing the way that we do these reviews into other spheres, is to try to actually promote this debate that we're talking about. We're going to start attempting to do things like subreddits, so that you can actually comment directly to us and comment to other people that are commenting to us, and start trying to form a dialogue with other individuals, even if it's just one guy yelling at another guy. And granted, be nice, it's Reddit, but it's still the internet, be nice. We want to start promoting these ideas and getting you more actively involved in what we do and what we present to you.
Yeah, the podcast remains I think the pillar of what we do here at Crash Chords. At the same time, that it's also very internalized. We can get caught up in the roundabout cyclical nature of just circling between the three of our ideas. There are more ideas out here, and this will be evident in the fan mail that I'll eventually read at the end of this podcast, because there are clearly other people who obviously don't agree with the statements that we put out there. But that's not the point of what we do. We just simply try to cover as many bases as possible. But it's impossible to cover every single base. Even just the three of us, it's diverse enough for sure. We've influenced each other, but also there can be moments where it develops into a kind of think tank that we can't escape from, that we need an objective cross-reference.
Well, and also it's really important that we, like Steve says so many times, to keep the discussion going. It's not about our reviews. Ultimately, shouldn't be the end-all be-all. That's why we don't even reference them till the end, and they're listed on a separate page where you can't see them. They're not mentioned in the body of the actual post, because our ratings don't matter as much as the conversation it sparks. If we rate something and you think we're completely wrong and you just get mad at us and walk away, that's not what this is about. If our rating is wrong, get mad at us and tell us why we're wrong. I love when people tell us why we're wrong, because music can be very objective, but also there are counter arguments to almost anything that we do. And that's also why I think bringing in the new writer, Tony, my auxiliary podcast that I do, Crash Chords Autographs, are things Tony's looking to bring up a conversation piece, and that's what I do on Autographs. I discuss with these artists not just their influences and where they start, but even how they feel about music, or feminism in music, or what games they played that led them to writing the nerdy thing they wrote. It's about a discussion and a conversation, because dialogue is more important than anything else.
Yeah, it's an intriguing thing because people see art as the kind of subject in which research is not required, in which people's own opinions really are theirs in every stretch. You don't really have to go somewhere and be proven right or wrong, but it always helps to learn more because, as you've earlier said, everyone listens to music differently. That's a value. That's not rhetoric speaking. That is a value that everyone should know early on, and it's helpful to check yourself every once in a while and consider whether the art that you've been seeing as art for years and years, whether there's more to it, whether there are higher steps, because that's what's going to push us forward as a society, not just from conceptual standpoint, but also from abilities, the things that we can open our minds to, our imagination, and so forth. It's easy to get stuck in a rut.
And frankly, if you're going to have an opinion, defend it. Have a reason why you're going to have that opinion. Yeah. And that's what we try to present here, the reasoning behind our love or hate and our just okay ideas about these albums. Because, yeah, nothing is in a vacuum. I know there's all these taglines, but if you really want to be able to just not even influence somebody else so that they can get along your lines of thinking, though I do love it when somebody falls in love with something I like because I told them how, because I told them why, because I showed it to them. But even so that from peace of mind, so you can understand yourself a little bit better, have that defense ready, have that idea ready for the reasoning, for just the idea of your opinion.
I think that's what I'm looking forward to most in 2015 for Crash Chords as a website, as a podcast, as a way of thinking, even a way of life. I mean, I mentioned on the site that music is life and life is good as a sign-off is more than just a sign-off. It's absolutely without irony or cheekiness or cheesiness. It's a way of life, and I'm really looking forward in 2015 for us to continue to evolve this dialogue we call Crash Chords to wherever it goes between YouTube and Twitter, Tumblr, Facebook, writing, podcasts. It's all about evolving the discussion of music as music itself evolves, because the musical landscape changes every year. We get things that we didn't think possible. I mean, even something as silly as mouth sounds last year was an evolution in music, because this artist is taking existing artists and creating, in some cases, very brand new music that I like even better than the originals. And that kind of stuff is very important and wasn't very commonplace. Other people do mashups, and they are everywhere, but the fact that got attention from us, got attention from other people, and actually had legs is a big deal. And I'm curious to see how music continues to evolve in 2015 and continue to comment and discuss it.
Yeah. And that everyone's opinion matters in the end. It's really, this is just the experiment of Crash Chords and of the Crash Chords podcast specifically is just a forum for bringing to light as many ideas as we can possibly conceive of for a given work. And as long as people start thinking about music in that respect, then I've considered our job a success.
And I think this is a great point to actually get to also one of my favorite things about the job we do, besides the fact that I just enjoy plain doing it. I enjoy when people get it. And we have a fan mail from someone who really gets it. Someone who submitted a fan mail, I believe, a few days ago from when we were recording. And what I like about it, before I let Steve read it, is, and of course introduce who sent it in, I like when people get it not because they're like, oh, they're great, because I don't care if people think we're great. In fact, I prefer people to crap on us because it's an aggressive opinion, which means there's an emotional stake.
As long as you could defend your opinion.
I like when people actually get that it's not just about agreeing or disagreeing. There's more to it than that.
Yep, and another thing I like about this fan mail from a personal standpoint, it is wordy, and I like wordiness. It's not, of course, not frivolity, but not capriciousness, but people who generally have a lot to say about a subject. I think it shows more investment than your typical, like, hey, great job, guys, great job. And I also noticed the same in Tony with our correspondence. Stand by your ideas, and the more that I see, the more writing that I see in general, probably the more I'm going to like you. Here we go. Mark Hughes sent us this this particular fan mail. Notice I'm saying fan mail today. We get no spam mail. Let's start the year off right with proper fan mail. Hi. I've been listening to your podcast for about half a year now and have been quite enjoying it. I discovered it kind of by accident on another site via a related videos link to the YouTube video of your review for Mouth Sounds, which you were just talking about, which we reviewed. That's Neil Cicierga's album. We reviewed that back in episode 94. Your detailed analysis and discussion of various types of music provides me with an intriguing listen. There are many times when there are opinions expressed that do not necessarily reflect that of my own, times in which I am left scratching my head or mildly cringing in horror. I enjoyed that. But I keep listening on with an open mind because sometimes a differing opinion will make you think about things in ways you haven't thought of before. Plus, you are clearly passionate about what you do, and that's what really matters in the end. Anyways, there are 2 albums I'd like to alert to you. One being an album that's connected to an album previously reviewed on the show, the other being an album that's probably my favorite of 2014. I don't expect you to review both of these, since that would be a little selfish on my behalf, how humble. The first is more of a curiosity than a straight-up recommendation, since I myself haven't actually given it an attentive listen. Back when you reviewed Daryl's Ohio, that was episode 114, John had mentioned something near the end about them putting out a new album. Curious, I decided to investigate and came to the conclusion that either they drastically changed their sound into some form of electronic dance music, or Spotify had messed up by categorizing different artists with the same name as being the same as it is wont to do, or John has been doing a lot more digging. Look at that jab. While I was convinced it was probably the second option, I decided to do some further digging anyways, and here's what I found. While the group Daryl didn't put out any new albums after Ohio, lead vocalist and principal songwriter Dylan Silvers did go on to form a new band with a few other Daryl members called The Crash That Took Me, named after the Daryl song of the same name, and put out 2 albums, Orchestrated Kaleidoscopes in 2007 and Chlorine Colored Eyes in 2009. In 2011, Daryl did reunite for some shows, but didn't put out any new music. However, Dylan Silvers started another musical project called These Machines Are Winning, which put out its first album in 2013, and you can check out more information about it here. He provides a link, thesemachinесarewinning.com. There's even some contact information for Dylan on the site if you're really intrigued to learn. All these albums are available to listen on Spotify, and a lot of this info I found via various articles from the Dallas Observer. That'd be something if it was the Dylan Observer about Dylan. The Dallas Observer, most involving Dylan Silvers. Link provided. For me, 2014, some afterthoughts here. For me, 2014 was a weaker year musically. There are a few albums that I really enjoyed, like Future Island Singles and Owen Palet's In Conflict, which we discussed. The latter of which I decided to check out because of your very podcast. For the most part, I just found a lot of okay albums from groups that had put out better stuff in the past. There was also Mouth Sounds, an album that was okay by my standards, but probably occupied my mind throughout the better part of the year for reasons that would take way too long to get into. But then, out of the blue, in the middle of December, an album was released that got me really excited. Now, in your last episode, you mentioned Aphex Twin, the promo for this episode, and how he finally put out a new album after a 13-year hiatus. Well, my favorite album of last year is also by an artist who has had a long hiatus between albums, and that is D'Angelo's Black Messiah, to follow up his 2000 album, Voodoo. For all I know, one of you might already be planning to suggest this for review, though I'm not completely sure what you guys will think of it. R&B, after all, is not a genre you've covered much, but I do remember you really liking Beyoncé's last album, and I recall Steve mentioning a few times about his fondness for funk music. It's an adventurous album that even if you don't like, I'd still be curious to hear what your thoughts are. Mark Hughes.
Well, Mark, I'm speaking to you directly through the magic of the internet. Thank you for your email. Sincerely and humbly, it was wonderful, honestly. You get what we do, and you get why we're here, and you're along for the ride, and I think that's the best part. To speak to the information you found out about Daryl, I actually can say
Dylan, excuse me.
Dylan, but from the band Daryl. A lot of D's. Actually, Spotify does do that a lot. There's a nerdcore rapper I've mentioned quite a few times who actually has a new album coming out this year that I'm excited about, Dr. Awkward, who's been mashed up with another Dr. Awkward, spelled the same way, that's not a nerdcore rapper. It happens a lot on Spotify. There's an issue with the algorithm where it meshes similar names together.
I also still have saved under my favorites on my tablet the website I was drawing information from when doing research for Daryl, and I just mistakenly saw Bloody Basin, which was released afterwards. It's a compilation album, not an original work. So that was my mistake, and I do apologize.
So we will look. I will definitely look into that information that you provided, and I appreciate that because I'm actually quite curious about these other projects. But I will say officially on the podcast that we are going to do our first fan recommendation of 2015 as your recommendation for D'Angelo's Black Messiah. Not only because you've recommended it, but also because I have heard a lot of good things about it. I know a lot of people who have been really digging that record. And honestly, a solid R&B record would be a nice change because I used to listen to a lot of R&B in high school, and there really hasn't been as much, I feel, that has made an impact. So we will take that on in the coming weeks, and thank you for your submission.
After your insightful comments and appreciative comments about what we do, I'm very excited for the listen itself. I think it's going to be interesting, and I'm going to also look up the other side projects of Dylan Silver's. I think I'd be very curious to see what he's doing now, a decade later, since that was kind of a belated album on our part.
So now I think this is a great place where actually, Steve, you can continue to tell us things with your mouth. And I don't know where I was going with that.
No, you can still.
Yeah, keep doing that.
You're doing
keep
fine.
making them.
Keep making the noises.
With
the
your
noises.
face.
The noises
Oh.
with the info. The noises that have the information.
Please, Steve, tell us what we're doing next week.
Next week would be my pick. I'm gonna go back to an album I discovered in college through my own roommate, Yo La Tengo. It's the kind of band that I think will probably give us some nostalgia back to some recent albums. For instance, the post-rock field is definitely immersed in that environment. Perhaps not to the same extent as Sigur Rós, but in many ways, perhaps a little bit moodier than Sigur Rós. You'll also find, I think, little snippets of electronica here and there to echo today's work, but certainly nothing techno-oriented. It'll be a smooth, relaxing listen, I think, for our second week of 2015. Here's hoping for the best.
And Yo La Tengo's...
The album's called Extra Painful.
Oh, well.
Maybe I should have glanced at that before I... Well, that means it will be the very introverted, contemplative, perhaps ruminating type of relaxing.
Staring into one's soul and peering down the darkness abyss.
Not relaxing at all, actually.
Please stop, all of you.
All right.
Slowly.
Well,
let's not soil where this was going.
Pick your listen timing.
Yes.
That's the question.
So we will take that on next week, and I guess this is a great place to say, for the first time in 2015, music is life, and life is good.
If you enjoyed this and other album analyses, topics, and guests, please subscribe to the Crash Chords podcast on iTunes, where you can also rate us and review us. For more media, also subscribe to Matt's one-on-one interview series, Crash Chords Autographs. To receive emails on all new content, subscribe at the top of our homepage. Also receive updates by liking us on Facebook, following us on Twitter at Crash Chords Web, our Tumblr, and our YouTube channel. And remember, keep the discussion going, because music is life, and life is good. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to share them in the comment board below each post. Otherwise, email us directly at admin@crashchords.com.